Section 1. The Empty Pedestals. There is a corridor in the Imperial Palace on Terra, deep within a section called the Kathmandu Precinct, where 20 pedestals stand in a long hall of remembrance. 18 of those pedestals carry statues enormous, towering things carved from stone and cast in metal, each one depicting one of the Emperor's sons in all the terrible glory of their creation. Some statues have been deliberately defaced since the Horus Heresy. Names carved into stone have been scored away with chisels, and faces have been mutilated by the same hands that once tended them with reverence. Those are the traitors, and their marks of dishonor were made in rage and grief by those who survived the war that almost ended humanity. They were hated. They were remembered as enemies. Their statues still stand, because even the hatred is a kind of memory. 2 pedestals have nothing on them at all. No statues, no names, no carved heraldry, no battle honors, no inscriptions. Just bare stone, worn smooth with the passage of 10,000 years, and a silence that is somehow louder than anything else in that hall. When Primarch Rogel Dorn walked that corridor in the darkest hours before the siege of Terra, he stopped at those 2 empty plinths and stood very still. He had been carrying the weight of the entire Imperium on his shoulders for months by that point, spending every waking hour converting a palace into a fortress, trying to hold back an army led by his own brother. He was exhausted and grieving, and probably afraid, though he would never have said so out loud. And standing there in front of those 2 blank pedestals, he thought something that should chill every person who has ever wondered about the shape of the future. He called their absences separate tragedies, and then, very quietly, he asked himself whether they had been warnings that no one had heeded. Warnings. That word is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. The thing about Warhammer 40,000 is that it is a setting built deliberately on the idea that information is power, and those in power control information absolutely. The Imperium of Man has spent 10,000 years teaching its citizens that the galaxy is a dark and terrible place, that the only salvation lies in service and obedience, and that the Emperor's will is perfect and eternal. Within that system, the erasure of history is not unusual. It is practically routine. Inconvenient truths get buried, heroes who became embarrassments get quietly unmemorialized, and entire conflicts get reclassified into categories ordinary citizens are not permitted to know about. The Inquisition exists partly for this purpose. Information control is governance. But 2 of the Emperor's own sons, being wiped from every record in existence, not dishonored the way the traitors were, not condemned and despised while still remembered, but simply gone, as thoroughly as if they had never drawn breath, that is something different entirely. That is something that goes beyond routine maintenance of Imperial mythology. Something happened with the 2nd and 11th Primarchs that was so significant, so dangerous, or so deeply shameful that the most powerful human being in the history of the species decided the only acceptable response was to act as though they had never existed. Think about the scale of that for a moment. The Emperor created these individuals. They were not ordinary people, not even ordinary space marines. They were demigod warriors, each one a pinnacle of genetic engineering, so advanced that the knowledge of how they were made was itself classified beyond the reach of most Imperial scholars. Each Primarch was, in physical terms, essentially indestructible by human standards, towering beings of engineered flesh and psychic potential, capable of tearing apart tanks with their bare hands and surviving wounds that would annihilate any ordinary soldier. The Emperor had poured something of himself into each of them. Their gene seed was the foundation of entire Space Marine legions, armies of superhuman warriors who carried their father's genetic legacy into battle. To erase one of these figures from history is not like deleting a file. It is like trying to pretend a mountain never existed while still standing in its shadow. The people who fought alongside the 2nd and 11th Legions remembered them. Other Primarchs knew them. The soldiers who served beside their warriors had years of shared memory, shared campaigns, shared brotherhood. The logistics of actually removing all trace of 2 entire legions from the Imperial record is almost incomprehensible. Every battle honor reassigned or destroyed, every supply manifest amended, every communication log expunged, every memorial stone broken down, every veteran soldier either silenced or themselves removed, and yet it was done. as thoroughly as anything in this vast and ancient setting has ever been done, which means the reason for it must have been extraordinary. That is the gravitational pull at the heart of this story. We are not talking about a minor mystery, a gap in the footnotes of imperial history. We are talking about a deliberate act of total institutional amnesia performed at the highest levels of human civilization, concerning two individuals who stood among the most powerful beings ever created. The second Primarch and the 11th Primarch are referred to in what fragmented lore survives as the Forgotten and the Purged. Those words were chosen carefully. The Forgotten suggests something that was allowed to slip away, quietly untended, fading without ceremony. The Purged suggests something that had to be actively destroyed, cut out like infected tissue, removed, because leaving it in place was simply not an option. Two separate fates, two separate tragedies, two separate empty pedestals in a corridor where the stone remembers nothing. This is the deepest mystery in Warhammer 40,000, and we are going to spend the next 2 hours walking through every fragment of evidence that exists, every whisper in the lore, every cryptic reference dropped in the margins of novels and codices over decades of storytelling. We are going to look at the theories that have grown in the absence of answers, some of them startlingly plausible, some of them delightfully strange. We are going to talk about what this mystery reveals about the nature of the Imperium itself, and why the people who created Warhammer 40,000 have made the deliberate choice to leave these two questions unanswered. Because there is something here worth sitting with, beyond the puzzle of who these Primarchs were and what they did. There is something worth examining in the idea of a civilization so vast and so old that it has genuinely forgotten parts of its own founding, or more precisely, a civilization that has worked very hard to make itself forget and done it so well that now even the erasure is 10,000 years in the past. There is also something important to acknowledge about the way this mystery functions within the setting itself. Warhammer 40,000 is a universe that specializes in enormous, world-ending threats, daemon primarchs tearing through reality, hive fleets that devour entire star systems, ancient mechanical gods waking from their galactic sleep. The scale of horror is so consistently cosmic that it can sometimes become almost numbing. But the Lost Primarchs are a different kind of unsettling. They are unsettling in a quieter, more intimate way. The way a locked room in a house you have lived in for years is unsettling. You know the room is there, you know something is in it. But the locked door is so familiar that you have almost stopped noticing it, and it is only on certain nights, when the house is quiet and the usual noise dies down, that you remember it again and feel the particular cold of not knowing what is inside. The Imperium of Man in the 40th millennium is a civilization defined by not knowing. Its citizens are kept deliberately ignorant of the true nature of the threats arrayed against them, the true history of their civilization, and the true condition of the Emperor himself, enthroned and sustained, but not, in any meaningful sense, governing. Knowledge is controlled, because knowledge is power, and the control of power is the entire project of the Imperium's administrative superstructure. But this not knowing is different from the usual deliberate ignorance the Imperium imposes on its citizens. This is not knowing that extends to the very people who built the structure, to the individuals most intimately involved with the founding of the civilization. The High Lords of Terra probably do not know the real story of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs. The Space Marine chapter masters, who might carry their genetic heritage, almost certainly do not. Even Gilliman, who knows more than anyone alive about the founding era, has things he cannot say and things he may have been told not to know. The mystery goes all the way down. That is what we are sitting with in this video. That is the texture of the question we are asking over the next 2 hours. The asking matters, even without the answering, because some mysteries are more interesting than any solution would be, and some empty spaces tell you more about the thing that filled them than any full record ever could. These two pedestals, bare for 10,000 years, are the most eloquent statement the Imperium of Man has ever made about its own nature, and they made it without a single word. Settle in, get comfortable. This one goes deep. If you are enjoying this so far, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing where in the world these videos are landing. And if the lore keeps you here, subscribe. There is so much more of this to come. Section 2. What it means to be a Primarch. Before we can properly understand what was lost when the 2nd and 11th were erased, we need to spend some time with what they actually were. The word Primarch gets used so often in 40K discussions that it can start to feel like just a category, like a label on a shelf. But the reality of what a Primarch is, what they represent, what they cost to create, what they mean to the galaxy around them, is genuinely staggering, and the weight of it matters enormously when we try to comprehend the scale of their erasure. The Emperor of Mankind is, by the time of the Horus Heresy, and certainly by the 40th millennium, a figure of such mythological scale that ordinary humans in the Imperium essentially worship him as a god. But at the time the Primarchs were created, he was something slightly more comprehensible, an incredibly ancient and powerful psyker, a being of superhuman intellect and near-limitless ambition, who had decided that humanity's only hope of survival in a galaxy full of horrors was to unite under a single banner and conquer everything in sight before something else conquered them first. The Great Crusade was his project, the most massive military campaign in human history, sending fleets of space marines and Imperial Army soldiers across the Milky Way to bring every human world into compliance and stamp out anything that opposed them. To lead this crusade, he needed commanders unlike anything that had existed before. He needed beings who combined the strategic brilliance of the greatest generals with the physical capability of a superhuman weapon, who could inspire absolute loyalty in their soldiers while also being genuinely terrifying to their enemies. He needed figures who were, in effect, mythological in their own lifetimes, so he made them. The specifics of Primarch creation are deliberately kept obscure in the lore, because the Emperor considered his methods to be among the most dangerous knowledge in existence. What we know is that he created 20 beings from genetic material that included something of himself, some portion of his own extraordinary psychic and biological essence, distilled into a form that could be carried by a human body. Each Primarch was grown in a laboratory, engineered to be physically perfect by any conceivable standard. They were taller than any normal human by a significant margin, with physiques that made even space marines look ordinary. Their intelligence was off any conventional scale. Many possessed psychic abilities of varying kinds and intensities. Several demonstrated what could only be described as an aura, a presence so powerful that simply standing near them could affect the moods and behavior of the people around them. But here is the thing that often gets glossed over when people talk about Primarchs. They were also people, genuinely, fully people, with personalities and preferences and flaws and private fears. They were not weapons given the appearance of humanity. They were human beings, in most of the ways that matter, given extraordinary gifts and extraordinary burdens. Some of them loved deeply, some of them grieved. Some of them laughed, argued, painted, wrote poetry, played instruments, built friendships, nursed grudges. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, was renowned for his artistic sensitivity as much as his martial ferocity. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children was obsessed with perfection in all things. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands was a craftsman before he was a conqueror. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves was, by all accounts, basically a very large and extremely dangerous person who enjoyed feasting and brawling and would die for the people he loved. They were people, and the Emperor scattered them. This is one of the more unsettling facts in all of 40K lore, and it speaks to something essential about the Emperor's character and methods. While the 20 Primarchs were still in their laboratory vats, before they had even been decanted into the world, the forces of chaos, those ancient entities of pure psychic malevolence that exist in the space between reality and unreality, feeding on human emotion and desire, reached into the lab and scattered the Primarch pods across the galaxy. The Emperor could not stop this from happening. Or perhaps he chose not to, because what followed served his purposes in ways that a simple delivery would not have. Each pod landed on a different world, usually a very strange and harsh world, and each Primarch grew up alone, without their father, shaped entirely by the environment they landed in. It is worth pausing on that scattering for a moment, because it is one of the most consequential events in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it tends to be treated as just a piece of background furniture, when in reality, it is the engine that drives every Primarch's personal tragedy. Consider what it means for a being designed to be a perfect, psychically gifted, genetically supreme individual to grow up in complete isolation, without guidance, without knowledge of what they truly are, on a world that was almost certainly not designed to nurture them. Some of them landed in relatively human environments. Guilliman came down on Macragge, already a sophisticated human civilization that gave him the bureaucratic and administrative context his enormous intelligence needed. Lorgar landed on a world called Kolkis, where the culture was deeply religious, and the seed of the Wordbearer's eventual devotional catastrophe was planted in that soil before he ever met his father. But others arrived in places that were actively hostile to human survival. Angron landed in a slave empire, where the ability to fight was the only currency that kept you alive. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, came down on a world so dark and so violent that he developed genuine precognitive visions of terrible things simply as a survival mechanism, spending decades alone in urban shadows where weakness was death. Vulcan landed on a world constantly raided by the Dark Eldar, those sadistic aliens who hunt humans for sport, and grew up in a community defined by its constant need to defend itself against beings who considered his people prey. Each of those formative experiences shaped the Primarch who emerged from them in ways so fundamental that even reunion with their father, even exposure to the wider culture of the Great Crusade and the intellectual resources of the Imperium of Man could not fully overwrite them. The man Angron had been formed in chains. The Emperor could give him armies and honors, but he could not give him a childhood that was not made of blood and suffering. The decision that the Emperor allegedly made to not intervene when Angron was first found to take him away from the planet where his gladiator brothers were dying in a final battle, rather than rescue those brothers alongside him, is, by many readings of the lore, the specific act that doomed the World Eater's Legion. Angron's rage was not inherent to his genetics. It was the specific product of specific choices made in specific moments. The point of all this, in the context of the lost Primarchs, is that when we ask what might have happened to the 2nd and 11th, what they might have become, or what they might have failed to become, we are asking about people whose fundamental natures were formed by worlds and circumstances we know nothing about. The worlds where their pods landed are not recorded, because those records were part of the erasure. The companions or enemies they had in their formative years are not recorded. The civilizations that shaped their first understandings of power, duty, loyalty, and the worth of human life are not recorded. We are looking at an erasure that goes all the way back to the beginning, not just what they did as commanders of legions, but who they were before they were commanders of legions. The whole story of what made them. Gone. That is the full weight of it. That is why the empty pedestals in the Imperial Palace corridor are not just bureaucratic gaps, but genuinely, profoundly sad. 2 entire human lives, extraordinary lives, the most extraordinary lives outside the Emperor himself, collapsed into nothing, into a notation in a ledger that says records expunged, and a blank space on a plinth where a name should be. The legions varied enormously. Some were enormous, the Ultramarines of the 13th Legion, led by the brilliant and methodical Robert Guilliman, numbered in the hundreds of thousands at their height. Others were smaller, but operated with extraordinary precision or specialization. The Space Wolves of the 6th Legion were few enough that every one of them was known personally to someone who had served alongside them, and their warrior culture was so intense and distinctive that they functioned almost as a separate civilization. The 1,000 Sons of the 15th were largely composed of psychers, scholars, and sorcerers, who pursued knowledge as religiously as other legions pursued conquest. Each legion was, in a very real sense, a reflection of its Primarch, or rather, the Primarch was a reflection of something that the whole legion then embodied collectively. When a Primarch was erased from history, they took their entire legion with them. Not just the records of the legion. The legion itself dissolved, absorbed, reassigned, silenced, or destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of warriors who had dedicated their entire existence to their Primarch's service, who had carried his gene seed and fought in his name, simply ceased to exist as a coherent entity. That is the weight of what was lost. Not a commander in a war, an entire lineage, an entire identity, an entire branch of humanity's superhuman offspring, cut from the tree as thoroughly as if it had never grown there, and the tree had 20 branches. We are missing 2 of them, and we cannot even say with certainty which ones they were, or what fruit they might have borne. Section 3. The Mechanics of Forgetting. damnatio memoriae. The Romans had a practice they called damnatio memoriae, which translates in a fairly literal sense as the condemnation of memory. When the Senate or a subsequent emperor decided that a previous ruler had been so terrible, so dishonorable, or so dangerous to the state's image that even remembering him was a kind of contamination, they would pass a decree. The decree authorized or mandated the systematic destruction of that person's image, name, and legacy. Their statues would be torn down. Their names would be chiseled off inscriptions. Their faces would be removed from paintings and friezes, sometimes replaced with other faces, sometimes left as blank ovals that were somehow more disturbing than any defacement could have been. Official records would be amended. Public monuments would be altered. The goal was not actually to make people forget that was impossible, and the Romans knew it. Most people who saw a blank oval where a face had been knew perfectly well whose face it was. The goal was to transform the memory from something honorable into something shameful, to make the very act of remembering that person a kind of transgression, to signal, through the visible gap in the historical record, that this individual was beneath the dignity of official acknowledgement. The visible absence was itself the message. Warhammer 40,000 takes this concept and scales it to a civilization spanning millions of worlds and 10,000 years of history, and it gives it a name that emphasizes the institutional and bureaucratic nature of the process: an edict of obliteration. In High Gothic, the Imperium's formal liturgical and administrative language, it is still called damnatio memoriae, and the meaning has not changed in 40,000 years of linguistic drift. It is the deliberate, systematic erasure of a person or organization from the official memory of the Imperium. It is declared by figures of the highest authority, the Emperor himself, the High Lords of Terra, or the Inquisition, and once declared, it carries the full weight of imperial law. The process that follows a declaration of this kind is exhaustive. Every record in every archive is to be found and amended or destroyed. Every physical artifact bearing the condemned name or image is to be removed and disposed of. Every monument, every statue, every carved inscription, every painted heraldry, every banner and standard and battle honor gone. The surviving members of the condemned organization are typically either executed, absorbed into other organizations, under conditions of strict anonymity, or subjected to extensive memory modification techniques that the Imperium has available to it. Witnesses to the condemned individual's existence are silenced or redirected. Future historians encountering gaps in the record are trained to understand that those gaps are themselves the record, that the blankness is a statement, not an accident. It is worth pausing on that last point, because it tells us something important about the difference between the lost Primarchs and other figures who have been subjected to imperial erasure. A truly complete edict of obliteration would, by definition, leave no trace of its own existence. A historian encountering a genuinely successful erasure would simply never know there was anything to find. The records would be seamless, the monuments would be intact, and the silence would be absolute and invisible. But the Imperium's records are not a single unified system. They are a distributed, redundant, often contradictory collection of documents spanning thousands of worlds and hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated administrative history. The Great Crusade alone generated documentation on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. Every expedition fleet maintained its own records. Every world compliance was documented in multiple formats for multiple bureaucratic purposes. Every supply manifest and casualty report and communication log created a paper trail that stretched back to Terra and outward to the edge of the galaxy. To erase 2 legions from all of that simultaneously would have required a coordination effort of extraordinary scale, and would have created its own documentary footprint: the instructions to expunge, the confirmations that expunging had occurred, the assessments of what gaps remained. Those metadocuments, if they exist, are presumably classified beyond any ordinary access level, but they exist somewhere. Everything in the Imperium exists somewhere. The other important consideration is that the Edict of Obliteration operates primarily on official records and public monuments. It has a harder time with informal knowledge, with the things that soldiers told each other in the field, the rumors that circulated in the lower decks of troop ships, the stories that veterans passed to new recruits in the way that unofficial history always travels. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the Lost Legions had been out of the official record for at least 43 years, based on the confirmed timeline. That is long enough for a generation of Space Marines to have grown up without ever encountering them in official documentation. But the veterans of the Great Crusade, the Space Marines, the Solar Auxilia soldiers, the Mechanicum adepts who had fought alongside the 2nd and 11th were still alive. They remembered. And the prohibition on speaking extended to them too. Under pain of consequences, the Imperium was fully capable of enforcing. The silence among living witnesses is, in its own way, the most striking aspect of the erasure. That veterans of shared campaigns, soldiers who had bled beside the warriors of the Lost Legions, who had seen their Primarchs in action, who had histories with them that went beyond official documentation, could be made to keep that silence, not just in public, but apparently in private as well, speaks to something about the weight of the prohibition, the Imperium's capacity for institutional loyalty, for the internalization of institutional prohibitions to the point where they become personal, is formidable. But the scale of the silence suggests something more than standard institutional compliance. It suggests that the people who knew were, in many cases, as motivated to maintain the silence from the inside as they were from the outside, that whatever they knew was something they would rather not speak of, not because the Inquisition was watching, but because speaking of it brought up things they preferred to leave buried. That is what we are sitting with. That is the texture of the question we are asking tonight. And the asking matters, even without the answering. What happened instead was an erasure so extensive and so thorough that it succeeded in destroying nearly all specific information about these Primarchs and their legions. But what it could not destroy was the shape of their absence. The Imperium functions on bureaucratic documentation to a degree that is literally religious. The Space Marine legions were numbered sequentially, and those numbers were embedded in documents stretching across nearly 2,000 years of the Great Crusade. You cannot simply remove the 2nd and 11th legions from all those documents without leaving holes that number from 1 to 20, with 2 entries conspicuously blank. The numbering system itself preserves the ghost of what was removed, and more than that, the Primarchs had brothers. 20 individuals who shared a genetic father, who had fought alongside each other and argued with each other, and, in some cases, genuinely loved each other. You cannot wipe the memory of 2 of them from the minds of 18 surviving siblings without those siblings being aware that a memory has been removed. The remaining Primarchs, loyal and traitor alike, demonstrate in various fragmented ways that they remember something, not necessarily who the lost Primarchs were or what they did, but that there was something there to remember, and that it has been taken away. The Edict of Obliteration, in their case, is described, in the surviving lore, as the most successful in Imperial history. That is simultaneously high praise for the thoroughness of the erasure and a deeply chilling statement about what it means for something this significant to have been done this completely. The traitor Primarchs, who sided with Horus, were not subjected to this treatment. Their names are known. Their deeds are recorded, at least in classified archives. Their statues were defaced rather than removed. Horus himself, the arch-traitor, the one who wounded the Emperor and plunged humanity into 10,000 years of misery, is remembered. Hated, condemned, despised beyond measure, but remembered. Whatever the 2nd and 11th did, it was treated as worse than that. The Imperium decided that Horus could be remembered as the great villain, the cautionary tale, the name invoked to explain why eternal vigilance is required. But the 2nd and 11th could not even have that. Their crimes, or their failures, or their tragedies, whatever word applies, could not be allowed to exist, even as warnings in the official record. They had to be non-existent. And that tells us something very specific about the nature of what they represented. Horus's betrayal could be shaped into a story that served the Imperium's purposes. His heresy became the foundational myth of why the Adeptus Astartes must be obedient, why Psykers must be controlled, why the Emperor must be venerated. His treachery was useful. The 2nd and 11th were not useful as cautionary tales. They were useful only as nothing at all. That suggests, quietly and chillingly, that whatever they did or experienced or became could not be shaped into a story that served imperial power. It was too complicated, too ambiguous, too threatening. Not to the Imperium's safety, perhaps, but to the Imperium's story about itself. To the idea that the Emperor's project was righteous and inevitable, that the Great Crusade was a triumph, that the Primarchs were paragons who either served gloriously or fell to the explicit corruption of chaos. The 2nd and 11th do not fit neatly into either category, and an Imperium built on absolute categories could not afford them. That is what the Edict of Obliteration really accomplished. It did not merely remove specific names and faces from the record. It preserved a narrative, it maintained a story, and it left 2 empty pedestals in a corridor where, 10,000 years later, even a Primarch can only stand and wonder what they meant. There is a dimension of this practice that becomes more interesting when you consider its historical precedent. The real damnatio memoriae of ancient Rome was not actually about making people forget. The Romans knew that complete forgetting was impossible. What the practice accomplished was something subtler and, in some ways, more effective. It transformed the memory from something that required active commemoration into something that required active concealment. It changed the cognitive work involved in remembering. Instead of maintaining a statue, a person was now maintaining a secret, and the effort of concealment is a constant reminder of what is being concealed. In the Imperium, this transformation operates at a civilizational scale. Every archivist who encounters the blank entries for Legion 2 and Legion 11 and dutifully moves past them is performing an act of concealment. Every Space Marine who learns not to ask about the missing numbers is practicing a silence that, over generations, becomes indistinguishable from genuine ignorance. The Edict of Obliteration creates, over time, exactly what it promises: a population that no longer knows what it does not know, because the knowledge of the gap has been metabolized into habit. But habits leave traces. Behavioral patterns carry the shape of what shaped them, even after the specific content is gone. The Imperium's deep cultural discomfort with questions about its own founding, its reflexive classification of anything touching the early Great Crusade, its institutional tendency to respond to inconvenient historical questions with suppression rather than engagement. These are, arguably, partly the product of the specific suppressions involved in the Lost Primarchs' erasure. The institutional muscle memory of the Edict of Obliteration has been exercised so thoroughly and for so long that it now defines the Imperium's default relationship with its own history. Which is to say, the empty pedestals are not just about 2 Primarchs. They are about a civilization that has been practicing forgetting for so long that the forgetting has become structural. Becoming the kind of empire that erases things requires doing the erasure. But doing the erasure also makes you the kind of empire that erases things, and that capacity, once developed, does not stay bounded to the original application. It spreads, it deepens, it becomes the way you handle all inconvenient truths, not just the specific ones that required the original act. The Inquisition, in the 40th millennium, is in large part the institutionalization of that capacity. An organization whose entire purpose is the management of dangerous information, the suppression of threats to imperial orthodoxy, the determination of what can and cannot be permitted to be known. The Inquisition is the Edict of Obliteration, given permanent form. And if its roots in the specific suppressions of the Lost Primarch story is not direct and literal, it is at minimum deeply thematic. Section 4. What we actually know the crumbs left behind. Here is the honest truth about how much confirmed information exists regarding the 2nd and 11th Primarchs and their legions. It would fit comfortably on a few index cards. Not because the story is simple, but because the erasure was extraordinarily thorough, and the decades of deliberate narrative ambiguity from Games Workshop and its Black Library authors have maintained the mystery with impressive discipline. But there are crumbs. There are always crumbs, because the universe is too large and too old for any erasure to be perfectly complete. A few fragments have survived, either deliberately leaked into the lore to tantalize, or accidentally preserved in the way that the most interesting historical artifacts always are not in official archives, but in the corners and margins of documents about other things. Let us go through what we actually know, one piece at a time. The most fundamental confirmed fact is their existence. The Emperor created 20 Primarchs. They led 20 Space Marine legions, numbered sequentially from 1 to 20. In every official listing of those legions, entries 2 and 11 carry the same notation: all records expunged. Not that they were destroyed in battle, not that they went renegade, not even a vague and dismissive designation. Simply expunged. The records are not missing, they were removed. That is the first and most important confirmed detail, because it establishes that whatever happened was a deliberate, institutional decision rather than a battlefield tragedy. The next significant fragment comes from a source that is almost too perfect in its accidental nature to be entirely coincidental. In the 41st millennium, a document called the Rangdan Genocides, a crusade field guide, was apparently issued to Solar Auxilia, the equivalent of regular Imperial Guard soldiers during the Great Crusade era, during a particularly brutal series of campaigns. This document, a practical manual for soldiers going into a specific theater of war, somehow ended up accidentally reproduced inside copies of the Astra Militarum's Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, the standard issue soldier's handbook for ordinary Imperial Guard soldiers in the present day. A clerical error buried at the level of a print run, and in that document, matter-of-factly and without ceremony, the 2nd and 11th Legions are mentioned as having fought alongside Solar Auxilia forces during the Rangdan Genocides. No names for the legions, no identification of their primarchs. Just the bare notation that they were present, fighting in a campaign that the rest of the document makes clear, was among the most catastrophic the Imperium had ever faced. They existed. They fought. And they fought in a war that, as we will explore in detail shortly, was so terrible it nearly ended the Great Crusade entirely. The third significant fragment is the one that comes closest to having a named source, which is the short story called The Lightning Tower, written by Dan Abnett. This story follows Rogel Dorn in the Imperial Palace during the preparations for the Siege of Terra. In a quiet moment in the corridor of Primarch statues, Dorn observes the 2 empty plinths and has the thought we discussed at the opening of this video. His specific words, as recorded in the text, describe the 2nd and 11th plinths as having been vacant for a long time. He describes their absences as separate tragedies, and most critically, most hauntingly, he asks whether they had in fact been warnings that no one heeded. Separate tragedies. That phrase is doing significant work. It implies that whatever happened to the 2nd Primarch, and whatever happened to the 11th, were not the same thing. They did not fall together, or through the same cause. Whatever their fates were, they arrived separately, through different paths. And Dorn, even in his grief and exhaustion during the worst crisis in human history, still thinks of them as tragedies rather than betrayals. His word for what Horus did was not tragedy. It was the worst thing he had ever experienced, the most devastating wound he had ever suffered. But his word for the lost brothers is tragedy, grief without rage, loss without hatred. The fourth major fragment comes from a conversation in another Horus Heresy novel, in a scene involving members of the Word-Bearers Legion, the first legion to fully fall to chaos, and the one whose corruption seeded the entire heresy. Members of a particular special formation within the Word-Bearers discuss, in fragmentary and careful terms, what they know of the lost Primarchs. One of them notes something that would become one of the most discussed pieces of lore about this mystery, that around the time the 2nd and 11th Legions were removed from Imperial records, the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, swelled dramatically in numbers to eclipse all other legions. The sentence is offered as a rumor, not a confirmed fact. But the implication is pointed and unmistakable, that the warriors of the erased legions did not simply cease to exist, but were absorbed into Guilliman's forces, carrying their anonymized gene seed and their forgotten histories into an organization that would eventually write the template for how all Space Marines operated. The fifth fragment appears in a novel called Descent of Angels, set in the early years of the Great Crusade on the world of Caliban, before the Dark Angels Legion had fully integrated with the wider Imperium. A librarian gives a young initiate a history lesson and mentions in passing that their Primarch has 19 brothers. The story is set in the 840 seconds of the 30th millennium. This timing is significant. The erasure of the 2nd and 11th had not yet occurred, because the initiate is told 19 brothers, meaning all 20 Primarchs are still in the official record. This gives us a rough chronological anchor. Whatever happened to the lost Primarchs happened after this point, And given the mention of the Rangdan Xenocides as a campaign where they fought, the timeline starts to narrow considerably. The sixth fragment is perhaps the strangest, and it appears in a novel called Fabius Bile, Clone Lord, set in the far future of the 41st millennium. Fabius Bile is a chaos-aligned former space marine who has devoted his existence to understanding the secrets of genetic modification. His investigations lead him to the Waimga monolith, a mysterious and enormously powerful Necron artifact in a region called the Attila system. In a passage discussing the history of this artifact, it is mentioned that in the early days of the Great Crusade, one of the lost Primarchs led an expedition to the Waimga monolith, and that no records survive of what happened during that expedition. This is a fragment deliberately placed to tantalize, connecting one of the lost Primarchs to a piece of Xenos technology so powerful that, in the modern 40th millennium, it demonstrated the ability to physically duplicate Necron warships on a massive scale. The full implications of that connection have never been explored in canon. The seventh fragment comes from the Alpha Legion novel Legion, where a passing comment notes that a Space Marine Legion had gotten into trouble before the events of that story, a reference widely understood by scholars of the lore to be pointing at the lost legions. The phrasing implies that their removal from the record was not entirely without precedent in terms of legions behaving in ways the Emperor found unacceptable, but that the scale and totality of their erasure was unique. There is also a deeply interesting piece of evidence in the descriptions of the 20 Primarch statues in the Feet of Iron short story by Nick Kime. In this story, the Iron Hands Primarch Ferrus Manus finds himself in subterranean tunnels and stumbles upon 20 statues of the Primarchs, all of their faces obscured by masks. He can recognize all of them through other identifying features, posture, armament, physical build, except for two. And the masks covering those two specific statues are described as split and almost destroyed, as if something had damaged them specifically. Not the other masks, not the other statues, just those two. The masks were already broken before Manus found them. In a place that seems to exist outside of ordinary time and space, an underground chamber that should not exist, the two Primarchs whose records would later be expunged are the ones whose identifying features have already been damaged. The imagery is almost too pointed. Their faces are already being erased, symbolically, before the Edict of Obliteration has been formally issued. As if the universe itself was anticipating what was coming, or as if the space in which the statues existed was reflecting a truth that the waking world had not yet caught up with. The final and perhaps most haunting fragment is not a piece of explicit text at all, but a structural feature of the lore that rewards careful attention. In the Horus Heresy novel series, which runs to over 50 volumes and covers the period leading up to and including the Siege of Terra, there are numerous scenes involving groups of Primarchs meeting, arguing, debating strategy and philosophy, and gradually fracturing into the loyalist and traitor factions that define the war. In many of those scenes, the dynamics of the Primarch relationships are explicitly mapped: who trusts whom, who has history with whom, who is mediating between rivals, who is amplifying tensions. And in every one of those scenes, there are exactly 20 Primarchs whose relationships matter, because all 20 contributed to the shape of the Horus Heresy, even if 2 of them contributed only through absence. The absence itself is part of the structure. The 2 holes in the gathering of Primarch personalities affected who filled the space those personalities would have occupied, what alliances were made or not made, what voices were present or absent in the conversations that led to war. 19 Primarchs navigating 20-2 relationships, building a civilization and then tearing it apart, in a configuration that was partly defined by what was missing. We do not know whose voices were absent. We do not know what they would have said. We cannot reconstruct what the Great Crusade would have looked like if 2 of the Primarchs had remained in it for its entirety, fully present and fully themselves, rather than being erased from the record at some point in the middle. But the structure of events that did unfold, the specific fault lines that cracked under pressure, the specific failures of communication and trust that led to catastrophe, was shaped partly by that absence. Something was missing from the Council of Primarchs, and whatever was missing left a gap that something else moved into. Those are the crumbs. Those fragments, scattered across decades of published lore, are essentially everything that has been confirmed. Everything else, every theory, every speculation, every impassioned argument across forums and comment sections and late-night gaming sessions proceeds from this slim evidence, which makes the theories all the more fascinating, because some of them are extraordinarily compelling. The project commissioned by Guillemot before he was wounded after the heresy, executed over 10,000 years by the Archmagos Belisarius Cawl. When Cawl's work was eventually revealed, it included a staggering detail. His experimentation had drawn on gene seed not only from the 9 traitor legions, but also from the 2nd and 11th. Cawl had somehow obtained, preserved, and experimented with the genetic material of Primarchs, whose very names had been erased from history. Whatever his conclusions from that experimentation were, they were not made public. Those are the crumbs. Those fragments, scattered across decades of published lore, are essentially everything that has been confirmed. Everything else, every theory, every speculation, every impassioned argument across forums and comment sections and late-night gaming sessions proceeds from this slim evidence, which makes the theories all the more fascinating, because some of them are extraordinarily compelling. Section 5. The Rangdan Xenocides, the most dangerous war you never heard of. If you want to understand the context in which the lost Primarchs may have met their fate, or at least the context in which 2 of the most confirmed fragments of evidence are located, you need to understand what the Rangdan Xenocides actually were, because they represent one of the most catastrophic events of the entire Great Crusade, and they are criminally underrepresented in most summaries of 40K history. The Great Crusade began in earnest in roughly the 800 seconds of the 30th millennium, when the Emperor's armies began systematically pushing out from Terra in every direction, reclaiming the human world scattered across the galaxy during the terrible age known as Old Night, when warp storms cut off interstellar travel and left humanity to survive in isolation on 10,000 separate worlds for centuries. By the 840s, the Crusade had pushed to the eastern and northern reaches of the galaxy, into regions that had never been mapped from Terra, and where human settlers had established colonies centuries before and been cut off from any contact with the rest of their species ever since. When the Imperial expeditionary fleets entered those northern reaches, they attracted attention. The Rangda were, and the past tense is appropriate, because the Imperium eventually ended them a xeno species of power and technological sophistication that, at the time of the Crusade, seemed genuinely capable of destroying the entire Imperial project before it had even properly begun. The lore is deliberately vague about their nature, which is itself significant. Even in the 41st millennium, the information about what the Rangda actually were is classified. What we know is what can be inferred from the descriptions of the wars fought against them. They were capable of attacking on a scale that overwhelmed entire expeditionary fleets. They could lay waste to worlds. Dozens of Titan legions, those cathedral-sized walking war machines that represent some of the most powerful weapons in the Imperial arsenal, were obliterated in the campaigns against them. Entire Space Marine legions were said to be functionally destroyed in the fighting. The series of campaigns, known collectively as the Rangdan Xenocides, played out across roughly 50 years, from approximately the 839s to the 890s of the 30th millennium. 3 major phases, each one more desperate than the last, and each one involving forces on a scale that would not be exceeded until the Horus Heresy itself. The Emperor himself, not a representative, not a proxy, but the actual Emperor, was required to personally intervene in these campaigns to turn the tide. That alone tells you something about the scale of what was being faced. The Space Wolves of the 6th Legion and the Dark Angels of the 1st Legion bore the heaviest burden of the Rangdan campaigns. The Dark Angels in particular suffered losses described as so severe that they would haunt the Legion for centuries. But they were not the only ones involved. Multiple other legions fought in these campaigns, and the document accidentally preserved, in that Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer, specifically records the presence of the 2nd and 11th Legions, fighting alongside Solar Auxilia forces in one of the major campaign phases. The timing of this is significant in ways that should be felt rather than just noted analytically. If the lost Primarchs were still commanding their legions during the Rangdan Xenocides, fighting in a war so catastrophic that it required the Emperor himself to fight in it, against an enemy so dangerous that dozens of Titan legions were destroyed, then whatever happened to them was not some quiet disgrace that unfolded in peacetime. It happened in the middle of one of the worst conflicts the young Imperium had ever faced. It happened surrounded by carnage and horror, and decisions made under extreme duress, with the stakes nothing less than the survival of the entire human project. What might happen to a Primarch in those circumstances? What might an individual engineered to be a perfect general, a flawless warrior, a living weapon shaped from the Emperor's own genetic material, encounter in a war of that magnitude that could lead to the kind of outcome requiring total erasure from history? Several theories intersect with the Rangdan xenocides in ways worth exploring. One of the more chilling is that the Rangda had abilities, possibly psychic, possibly technological, possibly something that defies either classification, that could affect the minds and loyalties of the beings they encountered. The lore notes that the resolution of the final Rangdan campaign involved not only military destruction, but the purging of human worlds. Not because those worlds had been physically destroyed, but because their populations had been somehow compromised. The nature of that compromise is not specified. But when you know that the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, two legions with particular reputations for doing what needed to be done, regardless of the moral weight of it, were the ones trusted to carry out those purges, the implication is that whatever the Rangda had done to those populations was not something that could be recovered from. If a Rangdan influence could compromise an entire planetary population, could it compromise a Primarch? Could it do something to a Primarch so thoroughly and so completely that the only viable response was to remove that Primarch from the equation entirely? And if so, would the erasure that followed be an act of punishment or an act of mercy? Would it be the Imperium condemning a traitor, or a father destroying evidence of a harm he could not bear to acknowledge? The lore does not answer this, but it whispers at the edges of the question in ways that keep many researchers of this mystery returning to the Rangdan xenocides again and again. There is also a deeply interesting timeline consideration here. The Rangdan campaigns ended in approximately the 890 seconds of the 30th millennium. By the time of the events at Monarchia, when the word-bearers were publicly humiliated by the Emperor for their devotion to his worship, only 18 legions are referenced in the records. That event occurred roughly 43 years before the catastrophe at Istvan V, which marks the formal beginning of the Horus heresy. Working backward from there, the erasure of the 2nd and 11th was complete by the time of Monarchia, placing it in the later stages of the Great Crusade. The Rangdan campaigns were over by then, but not long over. Whatever happened had its roots in that period. The gap between the end of the Rangdan xenocides and the confirmed erasure of the two legions is small enough that it is essentially the same era. The aftermath of one of history's most terrible wars, when decisions made in the heat of desperate conflict would have been coming home to roost. When whatever had been done in the name of necessity during those 50 years of horror would have been confronting the harder light of peace, it is worth dwelling on what that aftermath might have looked like, even in the absence of specific records. The Dark Angels of the First Legion, one of the two legions most deeply involved in the Rangdan campaigns, emerged from those wars diminished and deeply scarred. Their Primarch, Lionel Johnson, was not the kind of individual who processed difficulty openly. He carried things in silence, in the way that a being of his particular formation might. Having grown up alone in a world of constant danger, where showing weakness was potentially fatal. But the losses of the Rangdan campaigns were written into the Legion's culture in ways that lasted for generations. The Space Wolves of the 6th Legion were similarly marked. Their already fierce and somewhat fatalistic warrior culture deepened and darkened by what they had experienced in the galactic north. If those two legions were affected that profoundly by the Rangdan Wars, what did it do to legions that were less culturally prepared to process that kind of sustained horror? What did it do to warriors who did not have the specific psychological resources of the Space Wolves' communal culture or the Dark Angels' iron discipline? The Space Marine legions were created to be formidable warriors, but they were not created to be invulnerable to the kind of experience that the Rangdan xenocides represented. 50 years of fighting the worst threat the young Imperium had ever faced, watching entire Titan legions destroyed, watching world after world fall, watching the Emperor himself enter the field because nothing else was sufficient, that is, the kind of sustained exposure to existential horror that reshapes the beings who survive it. Consider also the specific nature of what the Rangdan campaigns required in terms of the decisions made during them. The after-action purges of human worlds, the destruction of populations that had been exposed to whatever the Rangda did to humans they came into contact with, would have fallen disproportionately on the legions, commanders present in that theater. When the Space Wolves and Dark Angels were trusted with those purges specifically, the implication is that other forces were either not present or were not trusted with such a morally extreme task. But some of those purges predate the final phase of the Xenocides. Some of them happened while the fighting was still ongoing. And some of the decisions about which worlds to save and which to destroy would have been made by whatever commanders were present and senior. If a Primarch made decisions during those campaigns that were later reconsidered decisions about which human populations were contaminated beyond saving, about what the Rangda had done to specific groups of survivors, about how to handle the extraordinary weapons and capabilities that a civilization of the Rangda's power might leave behind, those decisions would have had consequences that lasted long after the campaign ended. A Primarch who had authorized the destruction of populations that later turned out to be salvageable. Or, conversely, a Primarch who had argued for mercy in situations where mercy had terrible consequences. Or a Primarch who had encountered something during the Rangdan campaigns that they should have destroyed and instead preserved, out of curiosity or compassion or something darker. Any of those decisions, played out at the scale of a 50-year interstellar war, could have planted seeds that flowered into catastrophe years or decades later. And any of those catastrophes, if sufficiently large and sufficiently linked to the individual Primarch's judgment, could have led to the conversation no one wants to have. The one where you look at an extraordinary being you created and admit that what they have become, or what their decisions have made of their legion, cannot be fixed, can only be ended. SECH on. 6. The Whispers of Other Primarchs. If you want to understand how the surviving Primarchs feel about the Lost Ones, or rather, what they allow themselves to express about it, you have to read between the lines of a remarkable series of small moments scattered across the Horus Heresy novel series. Taken individually, each moment is a single note. Taken together, they form something that almost sounds like grief. The most significant of these moments involves Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, and, after the heresy, the architect of the Imperium, as it would exist for the next 10,000 years. Guilliman is, if anything, the most analytical and rational of all the Primarchs, a figure driven by logic and administration, who wrote the Codex Astartes and reorganized all Space Marine forces as a deliberate act of institutional design. He is not someone given to sentimental excess or mystical hand-waving. In the novel Dark Imperium, set in the 41st millennium after Guilliman's revival from stasis, he has occasion to reflect on his lost brothers. And the word he uses is not traitors. It is not the word he uses for Horus, or for Lorgar, or for any of the 9 Primarchs who chose chaos and war against the Emperor. For the 2nd and 11th, the word Guilliman uses is failed. They failed. He still saw fit to honor them in his own way. When he constructed a great round table with places for all his brothers, he marked the absence of the lost ones alongside the seats of the Horus Heresy's traitors, not to equate them, but to acknowledge them. The absence was intentional. The distinction was intentional. That word, failed, is doing enormous work. Failure is not the same as betrayal. Failure implies that there was something expected of them that they could not meet, something demanded that proved beyond their capacity, some standard set by their nature or their circumstances that they could not achieve. Failure is a tragedy in a way that betrayal is not. You can hate a traitor. You can only grieve for someone who failed. There is another moment from a scene in the first Heretic, the Horus Heresy novel, following Lorgar's fall to chaos, where Argyltal, a senior member of the Word-Bearers who had been fundamentally changed by his exposure to the entities within the warp, made a comment about the 11th Primarch, with very specific implications. He stated that killing the 11th Primarch in his infancy, going back through time or vision to prevent his birth, would unwrite a shameful future. That phrase, shameful future, is interesting not only for what it says about the 11th, but for what it implies about the Word-Bearers' relationship to that future. The Word-Bearers are, by this point, committed servants of chaos, and for them to identify something as shameful requires an unusual alignment of their values with whatever happened to the 11th Primarch. There is also a brief and cryptic scene in one of the early Horus Heresy novels, where Magnus the Red, the extraordinarily powerful psychic Primarch of the Thousand Suns, whose relationship with forbidden knowledge was both his greatest gift and his ultimate destruction, encounters the forbidden subject of the lost Primarchs in conversation with one of his brothers. The conversation is interrupted. The exact words Magnus was about to speak are not recorded, but his intent to discuss something the Emperor had forbidden is noted, and his brother's warning that the Emperor had explicitly commanded silence on this subject is delivered with enough gravity to suggest that the silencing itself was considered important. That last detail is the one that deserves dwelling on. The Emperor had commanded, apparently explicitly and in terms that surviving Primarchs were willing to invoke, that the Lost Ones were not to be spoken of. Not merely that their records had been expunged, but that the living Primarchs who had known them were forbidden from speaking about what they remembered. That is not the standard administration of an edict of obliteration. That is the Emperor extending the erasure from the bureaucratic record into the personal memories of his own sons. He was telling beings who had known these individuals, fought beside them, perhaps loved them, perhaps hated them, that their private knowledge was also to be suppressed, contained, kept silent. The Primarchs obeyed, largely, but the very fact of their obedience, visible in the care with which they speak around the subject when it arises, tells a story of its own. They knew something. They were told to stop knowing it. And the effort of not knowing is, in its own way, visible in every moment where a surviving Primarch's words carefully approach the subject of the lost brothers and then veer away. It is worth considering Mortarian's contribution to this too. Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, who would eventually fall to Nurgle and become one of the Daemon Primarchs of Chaos, has a single documented moment where the lost Primarchs brush the edge of his recorded speech. In that moment, he is not discussing them at length. He is warning against discussing them. His voice is described as unusually firm, which is interesting given Mortarion's generally fatalistic and cold demeanor. Something about this particular subject required him to be actively firm, rather than merely indifferent. 9 of the Primarchs, at one point in the late Great Crusade, had gathered on a single world. Magnus noted this, apparently beginning a comment about the rarity of such assemblies. Mortarion cut him off, invoking the Emperor's prohibition. 9 Primarchs, not 10. The subtext that what 9 Primarchs gathering recalled was a time when all 20 gathered, before 2 were removed from that number, is never stated directly. But the interruption is pointed enough that it does not need to be. These are the whispers that survive the erasure, the things a silence says when it is careful enough to have shape. But there is another layer worth exploring here, which is what the surviving Primarchs' varied responses to the prohibition tell us about their individual relationships to the lost brothers. Because not all of them respond to the subject in the same way. The variations in tone and the variations in what they allow themselves to approach before cutting off are themselves informative. Guilliman's response is the most measured, and the most politically sophisticated. He honors the lost brothers at his ceremonial table. He uses the word failed without elaboration, and he does not, as far as any surviving record shows, attempt to speak their names or reconstruct what is known about them. He has internalized the prohibition in a way that is almost administrative. He has processed the loss and decided that the processing will be private and the official position will be maintained. Dorn's response is more emotionally raw, even filtered through the particular rigidity of his character. Standing in that corridor and asking whether the tragedies were warnings, that is not the behavior of someone who has successfully processed and compartmentalized. That is someone who is still, in some fundamental way, sitting with the question, still turning it over, still hoping that if he examines it from a different angle, something will clarify into meaning. Dorn's relationship with failure was never simple. He was a being defined by his absolute unwillingness to acknowledge defeat and the existence of 2 empty pedestals that represented failures he could not fix or prevent or even fully understand seems to have been one of the few things that cracked his characteristic composure. Mortarion's response, cutting off Magnus, invoking the prohibition firmly, is interesting, because by the time of that interaction, Mortarion is already moving toward the ideological position that will eventually lead him to fall to Nurgle. He is a Primarch with a long history of resenting authority, of pushing against the constraints imposed by the Emperor, of finding the Imperium's institutional structures claustrophobic. And yet here he is, enforcing one of those constraints with unusual firmness. What would it mean for a figure who habitually chafes against Imperial rules to be more emphatic about following this particular one? One reading is that whatever Mortarion knows about the lost Primarchs frightened him. That the specific content of their fate was alarming enough that even a being moving toward rebellion against the Emperor concluded that this was one line he would not cross. That the prohibition was not just institutionally convenient, but personally necessary. That maintaining it served his own psychological need to not look at whatever lay behind it too directly. That reading, if accurate, suggests something about the specific nature of the lost Primarch's fate that goes beyond the usual parameters of Primarch failure or disgrace. The things that frightened Mortarion were not ordinary things. His entire culture, his entire psychological formation, had been shaped by a childhood immersed in toxic death. He was not easily unnerved. For the subject of the Lost Brothers to register as something he enforced silence about with personal firmness, rather than merely going through the motions of an official prohibition, implies the reason for the silence was genuinely dark. And then there is Magnus, who was reaching for the subject to begin with. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, whose defining characteristic was his absolute commitment to knowledge and understanding, regardless of the cost. Magnus was the Primarch who, in the name of saving his legion from a terrible genetic curse, performed acts of sorcery so drastic and so explicitly prohibited that they contributed directly to the catastrophe that destroyed his homeworld of Prospero. He was not a being who respected prohibitions easily, especially prohibitions against knowing. The fact that he was about to engage with the subject of the Lost Primarchs in a philosophical conversation is consistent with everything we know about his character. The fact that he was cut off before he could is one of the most frustrating lacunae in the entire lore. What did Magnus know? What was he planning to say? He had spent his entire existence in the pursuit of psychic and intellectual knowledge that most of the Imperium considered dangerously forbidden. He had contacts in the warp, access to information that ordinary beings could not even comprehend. If anyone among the Primarchs might have pieced together a more complete picture of what had happened to the 2nd and 11th from fragments and echoes and psychic impressions, it was Magnus. And whatever he was about to say, Mortarion stopped him saying it in a way that indicates both awareness of the content and a deliberate decision to prevent it being spoken aloud. That silence, that specific interrupted sentence, might be the most eloquent fragment in all the lore about the lost Primarchs. More eloquent than any of the confirmed crumbs we examined earlier, because it speaks to the existence of knowledge that survives the erasure knowledge held by at least one Primarch. Knowledge frightening enough that another Primarch actively suppresses it, even in private company, among brothers. The erasure was not complete. It could never be complete. But the people who carried the incomplete knowledge chose to behave as though it were. Section 7. The theories Chaos, Xenos, and Madness. Everything covered so far has been as close to confirmed canonical information as the lore permits. What follows is the realm of theory and speculation, and it is important to be clear about that distinction. The following are not facts presented as facts. They are the most compelling and widely discussed explanations that the community of 40K scholars fans, novelists writing within the setting, and game designers dropping deliberate hints have developed to explain what the confirmed fragments might mean. There are several major theories, and they are not all mutually exclusive. Part of what makes this mystery so compelling is that multiple explanations could simultaneously be true, with the 2nd Primarch and the 11th Primarch having met entirely different fates through entirely different processes. The Chaos Theory. Before the heresy, the most straightforward explanation, and the one that Games Workshop has most consistently danced around without confirming, is that one or both of the lost Primarchs fell to chaos before the Horus Heresy. This seems obvious at first. The traitor Primarchs were condemned, and their statues defaced, so why would chaos alignment lead to total erasure rather than the same treatment? The answer lies in the timing and the circumstances. The 9 traitors who followed Horus fell to chaos in a dramatic and public way, in the context of an open rebellion that the Imperium has never been able to conceal or deny. The Horus Heresy is the foundational trauma of the 40th millennium. Every citizen of the Imperium knows at some level that their civilization survived a near-fatal civil war 10,000 years ago. The traitor Primarch's corruption is part of that story, a story the Imperium uses to justify its current structure and theology. But if a Primarch or two Primarchs fell to chaos before the heresy, in the middle of the Great Crusade, that is a different and far more destabilizing narrative. It means the Emperor's project was compromised from an earlier point than officially acknowledged. It means that the heresy was not a sudden catastrophic betrayal, but the culmination of a corruption that had been growing for much longer, perhaps predating even the Great Crusade's full flowering. That is a story the Imperium cannot afford. It undermines the fundamental mythology of the age before the heresy as a time of righteous conquest and heroic endeavor. If Primarchs were falling to chaos while the Crusade was still in progress, what does that say about the nature of the Crusade itself? The Word-Bearers' connection is particularly interesting here, given that the Word-Bearers were the first legion to be systematically corrupted by chaos, doing so years before the official start of the heresy. They had operatives in the warp, and one of them, Argel Tal, speaks of the 11th Primarch's fate, in terms suggesting the Word-Bearers had at minimum some awareness of or involvement in whatever happened. If the 11th fell to chaos before the heresy, and if the Word-Bearers knew about it, that creates a dark and complex web of concealed knowledge that the Emperor would have had very good reasons to bury. The Xenos contact theory. Another compelling explanation centers on the possibility that one or both lost Primarchs encountered alien civilizations during the Great Crusade in ways that the Emperor's policy of xenocide could not accommodate. The Emperor's crusade was, at its philosophical core, a program of human supremacy. All alien life that could not be immediately subdued or used was to be destroyed, and any human world that had made alliances with Xenos was to be brought back into the human fold by whatever means necessary. This was non-negotiable doctrine. What if a Primarch, growing up on a world with deep ties to an alien civilization, had developed a fundamentally different philosophy? What if their formation, that crucial period of shaping by the environment that made each Primarch who they were, had given them sympathies that could not simply be trained away? The Emperor could tolerate many flavors of human culture, many forms of belief and tradition, but active sympathy for alien life, or worse, an argument that Xenos deserved to exist, was precisely the kind of ideological contamination that struck at the root of his project. This theory is often applied to the 11th Primarch specifically, partly because the hint about killing the 11th in infancy to prevent a shameful future suggests that the problem was inherent in who the 11th was, rather than something that happened to them from outside. If the problem was rooted in their nature and the world that shaped them, Xenos' sympathy fits the profile. The genetic catastrophe theory. This explanation takes the Primarchs' engineered nature seriously in a different way. The Space Marine legions are, by the time of the Horus Heresy, already demonstrating significant genetic instability in some cases. The Blood Angels carry a curse that periodically transforms them into rage-blind berserkers. The Space Wolves have their own biological irregularities that cause terminal mutation in a small percentage of recruits. Magnus the Red's entire legion was composed of psychers with unpredictable abilities. Genetic deviation is a risk built into the process of mass-producing superhuman soldiers from a template that was never designed to be mass-produced. What if one of the lost legions developed a genetic flaw so catastrophic, so total, and so uncontrollable that the entire legion had to be removed from existence, not as punishment, but as quarantine, not as condemnation, but as a medical necessity that was too horrifying to acknowledge? The Primarch's gene seed-producing warriors, who were fundamentally broken in ways that could spread or destabilize other legions, and the only response available being the total removal of every individual carrying that lineage. Under this theory, the lost Primarch might not have done anything wrong at all, in any meaningful sense. They might simply have been the victim of a flaw in their own creation, a victim of the Emperor's ambition outrunning his ability to predict consequences. That would certainly explain why the other surviving Primarchs remember them with grief rather than contempt, and why Guilliman's word is failed rather than betrayed. You fail when you cannot do what was required of you. You betray when you choose not to. The Rangdan infection theory. This is perhaps the most detailed and specific theory, and it draws on the confirmed connection between the Lost Legions and the Rangdan Xenocides with serious interpretive weight. The Rangda were an alien species of such power that they could not be defeated without the Emperor's personal intervention and the deployment of enormous military force spanning 5 decades. Their exact capabilities are classified even within the fiction of the setting, which means whatever they could do was significant enough that the Imperium preferred not to document it. One possibility, suggested by the description of the post-war purges of human worlds the Rangda had touched, is that the Rangda possessed some form of psychic or technological corruption capability, the ability to fundamentally alter the loyalty, sanity, or nature of beings they came into contact with. Not in the crude way that chaos corruption works, but something more subtle, more fundamental, something that might not even be recognized as corruption by the individual experiencing it. If the Rangda had this capability, and if a Primarch or both Primarchs fighting in those campaigns came into contact with it in a way that permanently altered them, the Emperor's response makes sense. Not as condemnation of a betrayal, but as the desperately sad conclusion that what was recovered from the Rangdan campaigns was not quite the same thing that had gone in, that the brilliant, beloved individuals who had led their legions into that horror had come back changed in ways that made them impossible to keep, and that the only thing the Emperor could do for them, in the end, was make sure that what they had become could not define what the legions they led would be remembered as. The Yimga Monolith Theory. The detail about one of the lost Primarchs leading an expedition to the Yimga Monolith deserves its own consideration, because the Yimga Monolith is itself one of the most extraordinary artifacts mentioned in the lore. Located in the Attila system, at the edge of the Sautek dynasty's claimed territory, the monolith is a Necron construct of ancient and staggering power, apparently capable of physically duplicating Necron warships that come into contact with it. The craftworld Aldari maintain a webway portal nearby, and tag it with the same rune they use for a particularly catastrophic warp anomaly. The Necrons, the ancient skeletal Xenos who served as warriors for the Old One's enemies before their civilization fell, and most of them went into sleep, lasting millions of years, are not entities that human space, Marines, even Primarch-level space Marines, engage with lightly. The Necrons at the height of their power were a civilization of immortal beings, with technology that made current human achievements look like Bronze Age craft. Whatever the Yimga monolith does, it does it on a level that defies most Imperial understanding. Why would a Primarch lead an expedition to this thing? And why would no records survive of what they found? The silence around that expedition, a Primarch-led military or exploratory mission, something that would normally be documented in extraordinary detail, is itself suspicious in a specific way. The absence of those records could simply be part of the general erasure, but it could also mean that what happened during that expedition was directly connected to the reason the erasure was ordered, something at the Yimga monolith, something the Primarch found there, or something that happened to them there, something with deep enough implications for the Necrons' relationship to the Imperium, or for the Emperor's own understanding of what his Primarchs were, that it could not be allowed to be known. The Necrons' relationship with consciousness and identity is itself relevant here. One of the most disturbing aspects of Necron lore is what happened to them during their transition from organic beings to living metal. The process, driven by their Cetan star god masters, of transferring their minds from biological bodies into mechanical ones. Most Necrons lost something fundamental in that transfer. Their memories became fragmented, their personalities eroded, and their capacity for genuine individual experience diminished to something hollow and procedural. The most powerful Necron overlords retain more of their original minds than ordinary warriors, but even they are shadows of what they once were. A Necron artifact powerful enough to physically duplicate warships is powerful enough to duplicate minds, to copy or alter consciousness in ways that have no human analog. If the Yimga monolith had some interaction with the Primarch who came to it, if it did something to them, or they did something to it, or the simple act of being in its presence, changed something fundamental in the most psychically sensitive of all human-derived beings, the consequences could have been extraordinary and deeply difficult to manage. This theory connects interestingly to the broader theme of what the Rangdan and the Necrons share in terms of the Imperium's classified history. The Rangdan Xenocides are among the most restricted archives in the Imperium. The full nature of the Rangda and what they could do is not publicly known. The Necrons were, for most of recorded Imperial history, not even properly understood. As a civilization they were classified as Necrons relatively late in Imperial history, having previously been dismissed as mindless automatons. What the Necrons of the Attila system were doing with the Yimga monolith in the early Great Crusade, and what a Primarch might have learned by approaching it, touches on information that the Imperium has had every reason to keep sealed: the Emperor's secret project theory. One of the more complex and philosophically interesting theories positions the lost Primarchs not as failures or traitors, but as sacrifices. The Emperor's project during the Great Crusade had multiple layers, many of which were hidden even from his Primarch sons. One of the most significant was his attempt to complete a massive secret project, the building of a webway network that would allow humanity to travel between stars without using the warp, eliminating the need to expose human minds to the psychic horrors that inhabit that dimensional space, and potentially starving the chaos gods of the psychic sustenance they derived from human suffering and fear in transit. This project was enormous, secret, and conducted in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace on Terra, while the Great Crusade raged across the galaxy. Only a handful of individuals knew it was happening. The project eventually failed, catastrophically, when Magnus the Red accidentally broke the psychic wards, protecting it during his desperate attempt to warn the Emperor about the Horus heresy. But before that failure, it was the Emperor's grand ambition for the future of humanity. If the Emperor's Webway project required certain kinds of psychic or biological contributions that only a Primarch could provide, something requiring their unique combination of superhuman physicality and psychic connection to their father, then a Primarch who was asked to sacrifice themselves for it, or who discovered the project and the sacrifices it entailed, might have responded in any number of ways. Acceptance, refusal, rage, despair. And the Emperor's response to any of those reactions, depending on their nature and the urgency of the situation, might have been erasure, not punishment, not condemnation, concealment of a cost he had decided to pay and did not want his other sons to know about. The forgotten and the purged under this reading were not disgraces. They were expenses, written off from the ledger with the same cold calculation that defines so much of the Emperor's approach to the survival of the species. And the empty pedestals are not monuments to shame, but to a debt the Imperium carries without knowing it owes. Section 8. The Ultramarines Connection. The rumor dropped in the Wordbearers novel that the Ultramarines swelled dramatically in size around the time the 2nd and 11th Legions were expunged is one of those details that seems almost too pointed to be merely incidental. It is presented in the text as exactly what it is: a rumor, speculation, something a wordbearer says, with appropriate hedging about certainty. But the text puts it into a character's mouth who has access to information that ordinary humans would not, and it places it in a context of other observations that prove accurate. Consider what it would mean if true. The Ultramarines under Roboute Guilliman became the largest Space Marine Legion in history, eventually numbering in the hundreds of thousands, an army so vast that it could conduct entire sub-crusades independently of the main Imperial effort, essentially running parallel campaigns across entire subsectors, while the rest of the legions were occupied elsewhere. This numerical advantage was part of what made Guilliman the obvious choice to become the post-heresy architect of the new Imperium. He had the men, the administrative machinery, and the sheer institutional weight to remake the Space Marine forces along rational lines. His Codex Astartes, which divided the single massive legions into much smaller independent chapters, is the direct product of that numerical dominance and the organizational thinking that came with it. If Guilliman's numerical advantage was partly built on the absorbed remnants of 2 erased legions, that changes the character of the Ultramarines' success. Their dominance was not simply the product of good recruitment and effective gene seed production. It was partly inherited from a tragedy, or 2 tragedies, that had to remain unacknowledged. Every great battle honor the Ultramarines earned after that point was partly fought with warriors who carried the genes of Primarchs who had been erased from the history. Those same warriors were contributing to. Every chapter of the Codex Astartes that governed how Space Marines operated was written by a man whose forces were partly composed of soldiers whose origin story could never be told. This is not presented as condemnation of Guilliman. By all indications, the man genuinely did everything he could to preserve and honor what remained of his brother's legions, even if that preservation was anonymous and unacknowledged. His decision to mark the lost brothers' places at his ceremonial table, even in the 41st millennium, speaks to a private grief that official imperial history does not and cannot record. But it does mean that the Ultramarines, the Paragon Legion, the Template, the organization whose founding document literally defined what Space Marines would be for the next 10,000 years, have a secret built into their foundations. The Codex Astartes is partly a document about how to use warriors whose identities had been erased. The second founding chapters, those hundreds of independent units spun off from the legions that carry the Ultramarines' heraldic traditions, may include among their gene seed inheritance something that technically comes from Primarchs, whose names are struck from every record they ever appear in. Guilliman knows this, probably knew it when he wrote the Codex. Perhaps it is one of the reasons certain provisions of that document are structured the way they are. Perhaps the anonymization built into chapter culture, the way each chapter develops its own identity, distinct from the parent. Legion serves not only the practical purpose of preventing another Horus heresy by breaking up massive legion formations, but also the quieter purpose of giving a new identity to warriors whose original identity could not be maintained. There is another angle to the Ultramarines connection that deserves attention, which is the specific timing and the specific legions involved. If the absorbed warriors of the 2nd and 11th legions were integrated into the Ultramarines, they would have fought in the remaining campaigns of the Great Crusade, and potentially in the Horus Heresy itself, under the Ultramarines' blue and gold, rather than whatever colors their original legions had worn. Warriors who remembered the campaigns they had fought before the absorption, who remembered brothers now anonymous or dead, who carried in their bodies the genetic legacy of a Primarch, they were no longer permitted to name. What does that do to a soldier? What does it do to a warrior who was trained, body and soul, in the culture and traditions of one legion, to be reformed as a member of an entirely different organization? The Astartes are resilient in ways that ordinary humans are not. Their psychological conditioning is deep, and their adaptability is part of their design. But they are still people, still beings capable of loyalty and grief, and the particular complicated feeling of carrying a history you cannot speak about. There is a specific term in the Warhammer lore for Space Marine units that have become separated from their parent legion, fighting under other commands or in isolation, often stripped of their original heraldry. Black Shields. By the time of the Horus Heresy, there were significant numbers of Black Shield warriors, Marines, who, for various reasons, had given up or been stripped of their legion identities and fought under neutral colors, answering to no Primarch's name. Some of them chose this path, some had it chosen for them. They fought effectively, but were regarded with a specific mixture of respect and wariness by other Astartes, because their loyalties were opaque in ways that clean, clearly flagged legion affiliation was not. If the warriors of the 2nd and 11th legions were absorbed rather than destroyed, they were in effect the largest single generation of Black Shields in history, eventually reflagged under Ultramarines' colors. Their Black Shield period, the time between the erasure of their legions and their integration into the 13th, must have been extraordinary in its psychological weight. They knew who they were. They knew what their Primarchs had been. They were told to behave as if both were not true, and then they fought the Horus Heresy, during which their brothers in arms were the Ultramarines. The legion that had absorbed them, which remained loyal to the Emperor, which endured one of the most devastating surprise attacks of the entire war, the assault on Calth by the Word-Bearers, and which eventually became the template for all Space Marines to come. If those absorbed warriors fought at Calth, they bled for an institution that had given them shelter but not acknowledgement. If they survived the heresy, they were folded into the 2nd founding chapters along with every other Ultramarine, their absorbed identities diluted further with each passing generation. By the time of the 41st millennium, the genetic legacy of the lost Primarchs within Ultramarine's successor, chapters, would be so thoroughly integrated as to be practically invisible. It would show up only in statistical analyses of gene seed variation, the kind of analyses that Belisarius Cawl, with his 10,000-year project and his access to pre-heresy samples, would be uniquely positioned to perform. Which brings us back to the Primaris Space Marines, and the confirmation that he did, in fact, find and use that genetic material. The circle is complete, or as complete as anything in this story gets. The lost Primarchs' genes are in the new generation of warriors. The erasure failed at the molecular level, and the architects of the current Imperium, Guilliman and Call, are the exact individuals most likely to know this, and most likely to have deliberately engineered it that way, as a form of preservation that the official record could never acknowledge. Section 9. Why Games Workshop Will Never Tell You. Here is the part of this story that involves stepping outside the fiction for a moment, to look at the real-world decisions that have maintained this mystery for decades. Because understanding why the mystery exists is almost as interesting as the mystery itself. Warhammer 40,000 was created in the late 1980s as a tabletop wargame, and its lore was developed incrementally over many years by a large number of writers and game designers who were, initially, making things up as they went and figuring out the shape of the setting by feel rather than following a detailed, predetermined plan. The concept of the 20 Space Marine legions and the 12 legions lost or turned traitor during the Horus Heresy emerged as part of the world building that gave the game its backdrop, and the two missing numbers, 2 and 11, were left blank deliberately, but for reasons that were more pragmatic than mysterious in origin. Rick Priestley, one of the earliest and most important designers involved in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, was asked about the Lost Legions by fans, and gave an answer that illuminates the original thinking. The blank numbers were left as space for players to create their own chapters and legions, to give homebrew creators a canonical space where their inventions could fit without contradicting established lore. The Imperium was described as having created 1,000 Space Marine chapters after the Heresy, most of them unnamed. Most of their histories undefined because players needed room to create their own armies with their own backstories. The Lost Legions operated on the same principle at a higher level, giving players who wanted to create a Primarch-level origin for their homebrew chapter a slot that was genuinely canon undefined. As the setting deepened over the decades, particularly through the enormously successful Horus Heresy novel series from Black Library, the Lost Legions took on increasing narrative weight. Writers began dropping deliberate crumbs, hints designed to tantalize without answering. The fandom and lexiconum communities that grew around the setting developed increasingly sophisticated theories. The mystery became, in effect, a beloved feature of the setting, rather than merely an unfilled gap. And here is the thing about beloved mysteries. Answering them is almost always a net loss. The question of what happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs is, right now, the most interesting question in 40K lore, precisely because it has no answer. Every person who has thought about it has their own theory, their own headcanon, their own emotional investment in a particular explanation. The word forgotten carries whatever meaning each individual brings to it. The word purged suggests whatever horror seems most fitting to each particular imagination. The empty pedestals in the Imperial Palace corridor mean something different to every person who reads about them. The moment Games Workshop answers the question, the moment a novel is published that gives one of the lost Primarchs a name, a history, a fate, all of that dissolves. The theory that was wrong goes away, and so does the theory that was right, because now it is simply the answer, and no longer a theory at all. The community discussion ends, not triumphantly but with a kind of deflation, because the thing that had made the mystery so generative, its openness, its willingness to hold many possible meanings simultaneously, has been collapsed into a single definitive version. There are also more practical reasons to maintain the mystery. Games Workshop has explicitly stated, through spokespeople and designers at events over the years, that the Lost Legions and their Primarchs are specifically left open for community creativity. Players who have built entire armies of homebrew Space Marines descended from Legion 2 or Legion 11 have done so with the blessing of the setting's creators, and filling in those blanks would retroactively invalidate decades of community creativity. This is not a trivial concern for a company whose product is, fundamentally, a hobby, an invitation for people to invest creatively in a shared world. And there is one more consideration, perhaps the most interesting. Answering the question would require Games Workshop to commit to a narrative that makes the Emperor's project more complicated than the setting can afford to acknowledge in certain contexts. The Emperor is simultaneously the god figure of the Imperium's state religion in the fiction, and the ambiguous moral center of a story that has been asking increasingly pointed questions about whether his methods justified his ends. The lost Primarchs, whatever they were, represent a failure in his creation, a failure whose nature would, if revealed, say something definitive about what kind of failure the Emperor was capable of. Was he capable of abandoning his sons when they became inconvenient? Was he capable of destroying what he created when it no longer served its purpose? Was he capable of concealing not just military disasters, but his own culpability in them? The answer to all of those questions is probably yes, based on everything else we know about him. But as long as the lost Primarchs remain undefined, those questions remain generative rather than answered. The moment specific names and fates are attached, the ambiguity collapses, and the Emperor becomes either more or less than he currently is, more if the revelation humanizes him, less if it confirms the worst of what the setting implies about his methods. The mystery is worth more than any answer could be. There is something worth adding here about how this compares to other great mysteries in the setting, because Warhammer 40,000 has cultivated a number of deliberate unknowns over the decades, and the lost Primarchs stand apart from most of them in a specific way. The question of what happened to Leman Russ after he walked into the Eye of Terror is a mystery, but it is the mystery of a character whose nature and history are fully established. We know exactly who Russ was, and the question is only where he is now. The secrets of the Dark Angels are a mystery, but one where enough of the answer has been revealed to give it a clear shape and emotional color. Even the question of the Emperor's true origins and nature, which is one of the setting's deepest puzzles, operates within a framework where we know at least the question we are asking. The lost Primarchs are different because we do not even know enough to properly frame the question. We know numbers, we know absences, we know that something was there and is now not, and that the removal was deliberate and thorough. But the category of question, was it a moral failure, a physical catastrophe, a choice, a crime, a sacrifice, remains entirely open. Every framework that might help organize the mystery requires making an assumption about what kind of mystery it is, and every such assumption carries the risk of being so far wrong that it forecloses more interesting possibilities. That genuine uncertainty, the inability even to ask the right question, is one of the rarest qualities a mystery can have. Most mysteries in complex lore become, with enough accumulated clues, questions with a shape, even if not an answer. You may not know the solution, but you know roughly what category it belongs to. The lost Primarchs resist that categorization with remarkable stubbornness. The same evidence that suggests one of them might have been corrupted by chaos can be read to suggest they might have been sacrificed by the Emperor. The same clue that points toward genetic catastrophe can be interpreted as pointing toward a deliberate experiment that went wrong. The ambiguity is not superficial, it goes all the way down, and it has proven resistant to all attempts to resolve it with additional lore, because each new fragment is carefully calibrated to be consistent with multiple interpretations simultaneously. That is, in the end, a form of craft, a deliberate and sustained creative achievement that has lasted decades and shows no signs of being abandoned. The two empty pedestals in that corridor will probably still be empty when Warhammer 40,000 celebrates its 50th anniversary, and if this setting is still being created and played and discussed in some form 50 years from now, they will still be inviting new generations of readers and players to stand in front of them and ask the question that will never be definitively answered. Some questions are worth more than their answers. These two are among the best examples of that truth that any creative medium has ever produced. Section 10. The Legacy. What their absence means for everything. We come now to what is perhaps the most important and most unsettling aspect of this entire topic, which is not really the specific question of who the 2nd and 11th Primarchs were or what happened to them, but the question of what it means that we cannot know. What it means for the Imperium of Man, for the 40,000-year story of human civilization, for the galaxy itself, that two of the most extraordinary beings ever created have been so completely unmade that even their absence is now ancient history. The Belisarius Call revelation is where this becomes most immediately tangible. Call is the Archmagos Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, an individual who has been working uninterrupted for 10,000 years on a project commissioned by Robert Guilliman, before Guilliman was wounded and placed in stasis. The project was the creation of Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of enhanced warriors, physically superior to standard Astartes, with better gene seed stability and additional biological implants. Guilliman's instruction to Call was to make better Space Marines. It was left deliberately open-ended. Call, working in secret over the equivalent of geological time periods by human standards, did not just improve on the existing templates. He experimented with all available genetic material, and when the details of his work eventually became partially available, one of the most striking elements was the revelation that he had obtained and worked with gene seed from the Lost Legions, from the 2nd and 11th, whose Primarchs had been erased from every record, and whose genetic lines were supposed to have ended with them. How did Call obtain this material? Where had it been preserved? Who authorized him to access it? Or did he access it without authorization? These questions are not answered, and the implication is that somewhere, possibly in archives on Mars, possibly in classified vaults on Terra, possibly in locations even less expected, the genetic legacy of the lost Primarchs survived the erasure of everything else about them. Their names were destroyed, their histories were destroyed, their identities were destroyed, but their biology, the most fundamental thing they were, could not be entirely eliminated, and Call used it. The Primaris Marines currently fighting across the galaxy in the 41st millennium, the new breed of space warriors who have, in many ways, superseded the older Astartes generation, carry genetic material in their engineered biology that includes the legacy of Primarchs who are not supposed to have existed. When a Primaris Ultramarine stands in defense of a burning world, fighting against the forces of chaos or Xenos, or whatever nightmare has come to devour that planet's population, they carry within them a genetic inheritance that includes something from two beings whose names have been struck from every record in the Imperium. The Primaris warrior does not know this. Their chapter master does not know this. The Inquisitor overseeing the campaign does not know this. Only Call knows, and Call is, by any definition, not a being whose relationship with standard moral frameworks is straightforward. This means the erasure was not complete, could never be complete. The thing that the Emperor tried to erase was too fundamental to be entirely destroyed. Not the memory, not the identity, not the specific history, but the biological fact of what the lost Primarchs were at the level of their genes. And that biological fact is now living and fighting and dying across 1,000,000 worlds, in warriors who represent the cutting edge of human military technology and who have no idea that part of what they are comes from the condemned and the forgotten. Think about the specific irony of that, held against the stated purpose of the Edict of Obliteration. The goal of the Damnatio Memoriae was to remove these individuals from history so thoroughly that they could not influence the Imperium's future. The result, 10,000 years later, is that they are literally embedded in the bodies of the warriors currently fighting to ensure the Imperium has a future at all. The Primaris Space Marines, the most significant advancement in Astartes technology since the original creation of the Space Marines in the Great Crusade, carry within them the genetic heritage of Primarchs, whose existence was declared illegal. They are, in the most literal biological sense, living evidence that the erasure failed. There is also something profoundly strange about the specific nature of genetic memory in this setting. The Primarchs were designed with what the lore describes as the capacity for genetic memory, some portion of their accumulated experience encoded in their biology and transmissible, in modified form, to the warriors who carried their gene seed. This is part of why Space Marine legions developed such distinctive cultures and instincts that seemed connected to their Primarch, even in cases where the Marines never met their gene father. The gene seed carried something of who the Primarch was. If that capacity exists, if the lost Primarch's gene seed still carries some encoded fragment of who they were, then the Primaris Space Marines built from that material are walking with something of the forgotten and the purged in their bones, some echo, some impression, some behavioral tendency or cognitive pattern that comes from individuals whose very identities were supposed to have been unmade. Call, who spent 10,000 years working with this material, would almost certainly have noticed. What he made of it, what conclusions he drew, Whether he considered it a problem to be corrected or a feature to be preserved is not recorded in any available source. Call is, it should be said, one of the most fascinating characters in the entire setting, precisely because of the opacity of his true purposes. He is ancient enough that he was personally instructed by Guilliman before the Horus Heresy. He served the same individual whose grief for the lost brothers is documented, and whose commissioning of the Primaris project was shaped by everything he knew about the Great Crusade era. Call received that commission from someone who knew the full weight of what the empty pedestals represented. The instruction to create better space marines, left deliberately open-ended, could encompass many things, including, perhaps, the specific decision to reach back to the lost gene lines and use what survived of them in the new generation. The deeper question this raises is whether any of the Primaris chapter masters, the officers who lead these new chapters in the 41st and 42nd millennia, notice anything unusual in themselves or their warriors. Whether there are instincts they cannot account for, traditions that seem to have no documented origin, approaches to warfare or governance or human relationships that differ in consistent ways from chapters with clearly traceable heritage. The biological memory would be faint, 10,000 years diluted, mixed with other genetic contributions, shaped by training and conditioning, and the crushing institutional weight of the chapter structure. But it might not be entirely absent. This is the kind of question that the setting leaves genuinely open, and it is one of the most generative threads in the entire mystery for any player or writer trying to build something around the legacy of the Lost Legions. A character in the 41st millennium who is somehow a vector for the genetic memory of a Primarch whose name they have never heard, experiencing instincts and reactions they cannot explain, gradually becoming aware that who they are is partly composed of someone who was supposed to have never existed. That is a story that fits perfectly in the grimdark, and it is entirely available to anyone who wants to write it, because Games Workshop has left the space open. There is something almost elegant in that, in a grim and 40K appropriate way. The Imperium has always been an institution built on forgetting its own sins, while continuing to be defined by them. The atrocities of the Great Crusade are never acknowledged, but they are why the current borders look the way they do. The Horus Heresy is officially a terrible tragedy, but the way it restructured imperial power is exactly what the surviving Primarchs and High Lords found most convenient. The corruption of the Space Marine legions is blamed on chaos, but the things that made those legions susceptible to chaos were built into them from the beginning by the pressures of the Great Crusade. And the lost Primarchs, whatever they were, whatever they experienced, whatever they became or failed to become, are now genetically encoded into the warriors of the 42nd millennium, doing exactly what they were originally created to do, fighting for humanity's survival, carrying the Emperor's legacy in their bodies, making the galaxy slightly more survivable for the species that has always found the galaxy deeply hostile to its existence. That is, in its own strange way, a kind of justice, or at least a kind of continuity that transcends the reach of any edict of obliteration. The empty pedestals in the Kathmandu precinct remain empty. No statues will be placed there because no names exist to carve on their bases, and the people who know what names those bases should bear are either dead or bound by the most ancient and absolute prohibitions in imperial law. The corridor where Rogel Dorn stood and wondered about warnings no one heeded has not been updated in 10,000 years. Because the Imperium does not update its acknowledgement of failures, it simply keeps building new architecture around them until the failures are load-bearing walls. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs haunt the Imperium of man, the way all genuinely suppressed things haunt the structures built over them. Not loudly, not visibly, but with a weight that affects everything above them. The Space Marine chapters that may carry their gene seed without knowing it. The administrative templates built partly to manage what their erased warriors became. The Codex Astartes, written partly as a response to whatever those legions represented. The Golden Throne that sits above a palace with 2 empty pedestals and 10,000 years of accumulated silence. If they were warnings, as Dorn wondered if their separate tragedies were meant to tell the surviving Primarchs and the surviving Imperium something about what the Great Crusade was becoming, about the price being paid for the pace of conquest, about what happened to extraordinary beings exposed to extraordinary horrors, then the Imperium failed to hear them. The warnings were not heeded because the warnings were buried under the same edict of obliteration that buried the individuals themselves. The Horus heresy followed. Whether that sequence is meaningful causation or tragic coincidence is a question the lore leaves open, because that is where the most powerful questions live, not in the answers, but in the space between the evidence and the conclusion, in the silence between what we know and what we can infer. Section 11. The Practical Mystery Homebrew, Headcanon, and the Invitation to Create. There is one more dimension to the Lost Primarchs worth exploring, and it is perhaps the most immediately practical one for anyone who plays Warhammer 40,000 or engages with its world creatively. The deliberate preservation of the mystery is not just a storytelling choice, it is an active invitation. Games Workshop has, over the years, made fairly explicit the fact that the 2nd and 11th Legion numbers are intentionally left open for community use. If you want to create a homebrew Space Marine chapter with a Primarch-level origin story, tracing your lineage back to Legion 2 or Legion 11 is the one move in the entire setting that cannot be contradicted by official lore, because there is no official lore to contradict. Nobody can tell you your chapter's history is wrong, because nobody knows what the real history is. The canon does not just permit your interpretation, it actively lacks any competing claim on that space. This is a genuinely remarkable design choice for a setting as dense and meticulously documented as Warhammer 40,000. Most areas of the setting are so thoroughly mapped that a player creating homebrew content is always operating in the shadow of an enormous existing canon, working around established facts and trying to find gaps that have not already been claimed. The Lost Legions are different. They are a deliberate clearing in the forest, a space that the official narrative has gone out of its way to leave accessible. The theories that fans and players have developed over the decades demonstrate the extraordinary generativity of this choice. Homebrew chapters have been built around the concept of the Dusk Specters, a hypothetical 11th Legion specializing in infiltration and covert operations, whose gene seed produces warriors with unusual psychological profiles suited to working in the shadows. Others have explored the idea of a 2nd Legion, whose Primarch had developed genuine diplomatic relationships with Xenos civilizations, and whose absorbed remnants within the Ultramarines are responsible for certain cultural traditions in Ultramar that seem at odds with standard Imperial xenophobia. Still, others have imagined Primarchs who discovered secrets about the Emperor's true nature, his pre-Imperial history, his relationship with the Warp, the true purpose behind his creation of the Primarchs, and were removed, not for failure or betrayal, but for knowing too much. The range of creative responses to the void left by the Lost Primarchs is itself a kind of testimony to the richness of the question. Some of the most compelling homebrew work in the entire 40K community has been built around these 2 blank slots, and the variety of what has been built there spans practically every possible tone and theme the setting offers. Horror stories where the 2nd Primarch was a being whose very nature was antithetical to human survival, a genetic experiment that went profoundly wrong in ways the Emperor refused to acknowledge until it was too late. Adventure stories where warriors descended from the 11th Legion operate in secret in the 41st millennium, guarding knowledge of their heritage from an inquisition that would destroy them for it. Tragedy stories where a Primarch did everything right and still ended up erased. Collateral damage in a conflict between powers they could not fully comprehend. All of these are possible, none of them are canonical. And the ground they share, the foundation of confirmed lore fragments from which they all grow, is genuinely solid enough to support all of them simultaneously. That is the creative gift Games Workshop has given the community by refusing to answer the question. It is not an empty space. It is a space that contains multitudes, and as long as it remains unresolved, every version of the story that someone has invested themselves in is, in its own way, valid. There is one more practical dimension worth noting, which is the model implications. Games Workshop releases Primarch models as part of their Horus Heresy product line, large, detailed resin miniatures representing each of the 20 Primarchs as they appeared during the Great Crusade and the Heresy itself. These models are significant commercial products, and the collection is eventually meant to be complete. 2 slots in that collection remain unfilled by design. The absence of models for the 2nd and 11th is the physical, on-your-shelf expression of the narrative mystery, a gap in a row of miniatures that tells you, without any text or explanation, that something is missing and that you are not supposed to ask about it. Games Workshop could release those models. They could announce that the 2nd Primarch is named and has a defined look and a specific backstory, and sell the miniature to an audience that has been waiting decades for it. The fact that they have, not the fact that across multiple editions, multiple studio leadership changes, multiple expansions of the Horus Heresy range, the gap has persisted, is evidence of a deliberate and consistent commitment to the mystery that goes beyond any individual creative decision. And the fact that any of them could be true, that the available evidence does not preclude any of them, is precisely what makes the space so inviting. In the broader context of narrative design, the Lost Primarchs represent something genuinely unusual, a blockbuster mainstream intellectual property that has deliberately left one of its most emotionally resonant mysteries permanently open, not because the creators do not know the answer, but because they have concluded that the question is worth more than any answer could be. That is not a commercially obvious choice. It would be very easy to publish a Horus Heresy novel revealing the identity and fate of the 2nd Primarch, sell enormous numbers of copies, and perhaps release new miniature models to accompany it. The commercial incentive to resolve the mystery is substantial. That Games Workshop has, for decades, consistently declined that option, tells you something about the institutional understanding of what makes this setting work at its best. The grimdark, the deliberately bleak and oppressive atmosphere that defines 40K's aesthetic and philosophical texture depends not only on visible horrors, but on implied ones. The horrors you cannot see, cannot name, cannot fully comprehend are the ones that stay with you longest. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs, precisely because they are nothing more than empty pedestals and a handful of cryptic references, represent something that the most detailed, explicit account could never quite capture: the specific feeling of a vast civilization standing over its own buried sins and continuing to function as if the ground beneath it is solid. Section 12. What remains? We come to the end now, and the honest conclusion is that we know almost nothing, and what we know implies something large that we cannot quite see the shape of. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs existed. They fought in the Great Crusade, including in the most terrible wars of that era. They were erased from the imperial record before the Horus Heresy, through an edict of obliteration so thorough that it remains, 10,000 years later, the most successful in imperial history. Their surviving brothers remember them with grief, not contempt. Their gene seed survived the erasure in at least one classified location, and has been used by Belisarius Cawl in the creation of the new generation of Space Marine warriors. 2 pedestals in the Imperial Palace corridor remain bare, and have remained so for 10,000 years. Everything else is inference and theory. But the inference and theory, taken together, describe an Imperium that is haunted in a very specific way. An Imperium that could look at 2 of the most extraordinary beings in human history, beings the Emperor created from his own genetic essence, beings who led armies of superhuman warriors and fought wars on scales that defy ordinary comprehension, and decide that the most appropriate response to whatever happened with them was to pretend they had never existed. An Imperium that built its administrative and military foundations partly on the anonymous remnants of those erased figures. An Imperium that instructs even its gods in waiting, even the Primarchs themselves, to maintain the silence. That is not the Imperium of a triumphant and righteous civilization. That is the Imperium of something older and stranger and more genuinely frightening, a civilization that has learned to live with enormous and perhaps irresolvable shame by converting it into institutional silence so complete even the shame is eventually forgotten, leaving only the structures built to contain it. Consider what it means that the Horus Heresy followed. Dorn, standing in that corridor, asked whether the tragedies of the 2nd and 11th had been warnings. He was asking at the moment when everything was burning, when the worst possible outcome was unfolding around him, when the Imperium he had spent his entire existence building was being torn apart by his own brothers. And in that moment of maximum catastrophe, his mind went to the 2 empty pedestals, not to Horus's corruption, not to Lorgar's seduction, not to any of the 10,000 decisions and failures and cruelties that had led to the siege of Terra. to the empty pedestals. Why? Because in some part of his mind that he could not fully articulate, the pattern of what had happened to the 2nd and 11th rhymed with what was happening now. Something about the nature of those failures, their character, their cause, the way they had been handled, was relevant to the catastrophe unfolding around him. He did not say that out loud. He could not say it out loud because the prohibition was absolute and the circumstances did not allow for careful philosophical reflection. But the thought was there, quick and precise as a blade, in the mind of the Primarch, who above all others was defined by refusing to flinch from necessary truths. The warnings had been there. Whatever the 2nd and 11th represented, whatever flaw in the Emperor's project, whatever consequence of his methods, whatever fragility built into the Great Crusade from its beginning, it had been visible. Someone had seen it. Someone had decided that the appropriate response was silence rather than correction. And then the heresy came, and in its wreckage, a Primarch stood, looking at 2 empty pedestals and asked, too late, whether those silent lessons might have mattered. The 2nd Primarch and the 11th Primarch are the Imperium's deepest secret, not because of what they did or what was done to them, but because of what their erasure reveals about the people who erased them and the civilization that was preserved in the aftermath. Every time a Space Marine fights and dies in the Emperor's name, they fight and die in a story that has 2 chapters missing from it. Every time the Adeptus Astartes updates the Codex, revises the doctrines, honors the founding traditions of the legions, they honor traditions that were built over a gap. The absence is structural. The empty pedestals are load-bearing. Rogel Dorn went back to building walls. That, ultimately, is the Imperium of Man in its most honest form. Enormous walls, built over everything that could not be acknowledged. Functional, in a grim and grinding way. Surviving, in the most expensive and painful way possible. And somewhere in its foundations, the genetic memory of 2 individuals whose names it has spent 10,000 years refusing to speak. Whatever they were, they deserved better than that. Most things in this setting do. But then, that is rather the point.